Thank you very much, Bill. I'm grateful to be with you again, and I'm really looking forward to talking about this particular book. I didn't know about C.S. Lewis till I was in college. It was my junior year. My older sister was teaching fifth grade, and she told me the plot of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was visiting her for dinner one time. And I was amazed. So I went out and bought the Narnian books and read through them. I was fascinated by the books, but I wanted to find out more about Lewis. So I picked up Surprised by Joy. And that was the book that really hooked me into Lewis studies. I was amazed as he told the story of this deep longing in his heart and the quest to find the object of that longing. I knew the longings. He gave me a vocabulary for my own heart. I never had anybody in my limited reading talk about these longings like he did. Now, Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors. And so I read all the books. I try to read as many books as I can that he refers to. And I find people all over the place talking about these longings. It's like St. Augustine said in the Confessions, our hearts restless, O God, until they find their rest in thee. But Lewis was the first person to introduce me to vocabulary for my own soul. And it came from this book, Surprised by Joy. And that's why I'm eager to talk about it this evening. It's basically an autobiography, but it's difficult writing an autobiography. Just as a little background on the book, it's even more difficult to write a biography. For just one moment, think of all the thoughts you've had today since you got up. How many of them have you processed with other people? And this is the interesting thing. When you think about the complexity of our lives, we're basically mysteries to one another. When my older brother died, he was only 48 years old. When my sister's husband died, he was only 50. Those deaths came pretty close in our family, and I was the one given the responsibility to give their eulogies. I loved these two men. I knew them well, I thought, till I tried to craft their eulogy and tell their life story. And I realized our lives are so full and teeming with details. Who could ever do that? There's only one person that could probably make sense of all the things that define us as we are, and that would be God himself. But anytime you sit down to try to write a biography or an autobiography, you're best off not trying to just throw in all the details, but find a narrative thread that you can weave through those details to begin to make sense of it. So, for example, Alan Jacobs, when he wrote his book, The Narnian, about C.S. Lewis, he sought to look at Lewis's imaginative development. That was one thread woven through the vast fabric of Lewis's life, but it made sense. It helped move the story along. And in giving us one particular thread, he opened the door for us to understand Lewis a little better. Same thing with Lyle Dorset. When he wrote his biography on Lewis, he basically traced Lewis's spiritual development. Following that thread, he was able to tell us a significant story. On the other hand, I saw a shortcoming with Alistair McGrath's biography of C.S. Lewis. Now, let me say some things to McGrath's credit. One, he's a brilliant scholar. Two, he read all of Lewis's writings in chronological order in order to tell Lewis's story and to try and tell it well. He's also a great writer. You hang on every word. But whenever somebody says that they're going to produce a definitive biography on anybody, it should cause skepticism to awaken in you. Who could write that definitive biography? In Surprised by Joy, where Lewis is silent about some of the details of his life, McGrath starts asking these kinds of questions. Why did Lewis leave out information in his autobiography? Was he hiding something from his readers? Why did he not write more about his war experiences? Was he traumatized by them? Actually, Lewis was only in the trenches in World War I for 3 months and 1 week. Now, that should be enough. He got to the trenches November 29, 1917, he tells us in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. and he was wounded April 15, 1918. Well, if you look at that, that would be about 3.5, 4 months. But there were 3 weeks at that time he was in the hospital with trench fever. So he wasn't in the trenches very long. And he told that part of his war experience that was necessary to his own narrative, but McGrath starts to project on that. He engages in what C.S. Lewis called um, transforming imagination, where a person transforms a reality to fit what they want to say about it rather than adjust what they want to say based on the reality itself. In World War One, Lewis says he picked up G.K. Chesterton as an author. That helped push him towards his own conversion. He learned to appreciate and admire the common man, he says, in a chapter in Surprised by Joy called Guns and Good Company. When he writes later, there are no mere mortals in The Weight of Glory. Some of that was probably fed by those war experiences. And he became sensitive to audiences later as he would write. So Lewis left out certain details because they weren't important to the story he was trying to tell. Further, McGrath second guesses Lewis's narrative when it comes to what Lewis says about his school life. He says, why did Lewis say that he had such bad school experiences? It conflicts with what Lewis's brother, Major Warren Lewis, said about going to those same schools. He didn't have the conflict that Lewis had. And yet you can't do that. You can't say, okay, if two brothers go through schools 3 years apart, we should expect that they would have the exact same experiences. We have different personalities. We process things differently. You could talk about 4 children born in one family. They have the same biological mother and father, but they all have, in a sense, different parents because the parents are developing in the process as well. And so McGrath unfortunately doesn't account for this stuff. And he fills in what he doesn't know with projection. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis says his father had a tendency to read between the lines. When Lewis writes literary criticism and experiment criticism, he warns against reading between the lines when you read literature, because you often miss the lines themselves. I say these things to contrast Grath's work with Lewis's actual intention. What was Lewis doing when he wrote Surprised by Joy? Well, Lewis isn't trying to be cryptic. He titles the book Surprised by Joy, subtitles it The Shape of My Early Life. It wasn't like some sort of manufactured shape that he was trying to invent. One of Lewis's friends even called it Suppressed by Jack. Jack was Lewis's nickname, and he was trying to say that Lewis suppressed particular ideas. It's not true. As a matter of fact, I every once in a while hear people quote that statement by Dr. Havard, who was one of the Inklings, a very close friend of Lewis's. But it's an unfortunate statement. He was saying the shape of my early life. He's trying to bring to his readers what was going on, and to answer, he says in the preface to the book, to answer requests that he, Lewis, tell how he moved from atheism to Christianity, and to correct some false notions that had gotten about. I have no clue what the false notions were. But nevertheless, excuse me, he wanted to explain the phenomenon also he calls joy. Talk more about that in a moment. So the book aims, Lewis says specifically, it's quoting Lewis, the book aims at telling the story of my conversion and is not a general autobiography. So now we know exactly why Lewis is saying what he wants to say. It's the things that would help with that narrative. Before getting to the content, another observation must be said. Lewis wrote, when a man writes a love sonnet, he not only loves the beloved, he also loves the sonnet. He picks a literary form to fit his subject. As an author may select a frame, or excuse me, an artist may select a frame for his painting. Lewis writes an essay called Sometimes Fairy Stories Say Best What Needs to Be Said. And Lewis wrote fairy stories in Narnia Chronicles because he wanted to say something specific through that particular literary genre. He even says when he wrote science fiction, he wanted to write romantic literature. That's to long for a place. It comes from Virgil's the Aeneid, where Aeneas is in the city of Troy when it's destroyed. He is encouraged to leave Troy and take people with him and start a new city. And he's a man caught between the two cities. And so he will go to build Rome. Romantic literature is about going to Rome. It's picked up. We apply it to other things too. The romantic longing and relationship, the romantic longing for place, the romantic longing to have what's broken in us fixed, these sorts of things. Lewis wrote science fiction because he felt the earth had been explored thoroughly. So what if I wrote romantic literature, but having it be extraterrestrial? So he chose science fiction as a means for what he wanted to say. Surprised by Joy, an autobiography, is testimonial apologetics for Lewis. He wrote his own story of faith in order to help other people maybe sort through their own pilgrimage. Not infrequently, Lewis would also publish approaches to different topics where he would look at them two ways. For example, he might look at something propositionally, and then he might look at the same ideas imaginatively. For example, the abolition of man. He writes about also in That Hideous Strength, same ideas. It's about objectivity, the loss of objectivity, and the destruction of the society that throws objectivity out the window. The Four Loves is a book he writes about the nature of love propositionally. Till We Have Faces is the way he imaginatively depicts the abuses of love, the growth in love, real love, loves in its many expressions. Even Surprised by Joy, which is a rather propositional, autobiographical depiction of what was happening in Lewis spiritually as he came to faith, from atheism to faith, he writes similarly in a work of fiction called The Pilgrims Regress. And consequently, Surprised by Joy, I'll come back to Pilgrims Regress in just a minute, because it's something that will highlight and help us understand Surprised by Joy better. But in Surprised by Joy, as far as the content goes, he follows three threads through the narrative cloth. Three threads. To set the context for the three threads, Lewis wrote a book called The Arthurian Torso. He had a friend and fellow inkling, Charles Williams, who wrote a cycle of lyric poems on the Arthurian legend. It was called Taliesin Through Logres. Taliesin was a court poet for Arthur's Camelot. And so when Williams wrote these poems, Lewis thought they were fairly obtuse. He had talked with Williams Lewis thought they were fairly obtuse. He had talked to Williams quite a bit about it. When Williams died, Lewis wrote literary criticism to help people understand those poems. It's sort of a debt of honor to his good friend who passed away. But he writes in that book, Lewis writes, that the first problem of life is how do you fit the stone in the shell? The image comes from something Williams had written in his book, Taliesin Through Logres. Williams had borrowed it from Wordsworth's The Prelude. And in the Prelude, Wordsworth has a Bedouin shepherd walking along with a stone in one hand and a shell in the other. He's trying to fit them together. The stone represented reason. The shell represented the longings of the heart. How do you fit head and heart together? And Lewis said, this is the first problem of life. How do you fit head and heart together? The Pilgrims Regress, this allegorical autobiography, Lewis titled The Pilgrims Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. And in this particular book, Lewis is trying to say it is Christianity that can bring these things together. Consequently, we could even say, why are they divided in the first place? Theologically, Lewis understood that sin divides us. Sin is man trying to play God of his own life. And therefore, sin puts us in estrangement with God himself. Not only that, if sin is people trying to play God of their own lives, it puts us in conflict with one another. We're a bunch of anarchists, and anarchists make bad community people. But furthermore, it not only divides us from God and from others, it divides us even from ourselves. And so we have this fracturing of what it is to be human that comes after the fall. And how do you fit these things together? So in The Pilgrims Regress, the main character is a guy named John. And he sees a vision of an island off in the distance. And his whole heart is driven towards the quest to find the island. While he goes on his quest, if he drifts towards the mountains in the north, they're craggy and hard. That's reason, but reason unbalanced by the heart. If he goes to the south, he ends up in swamps. It's murky. It's issues of the heart, but without the balance of reason. He needs to stay on the center path. And the only thing that he finds that could ultimately bring them together in this allegory, which is, by the way, the only allegory Lewis ever wrote. Narnian books aren't allegories. He called them supposals. But the only thing that can bring them together is Mother Kirk in that book, who represents the church, or more importantly, represents Christ. So the first thread then that we look at in these three threads, the first thread in that context of how do we fit head and heart and the place that Christ has to do that. The first thread in Surprised by Joy, we look at his rejection of Christianity, his boyhood faith, and his eventual recovery of that faith. That storyline is going on throughout the book. We'll look at some of the details in a minute. It was triggered by his mother's death. He had well-meaning people in his church where his grandfather had been the pastor tell him, if you pray, your mom will get better. You can't make those guarantees to a child. He prayed. He prayed with all the intensity of a little boy who thought his prayers might save his mother. She got worse. He was told again by these same people, if you pray harder, she'll get better. He prayed harder and she died, and he began to think God doesn't exist, or if he does, he doesn't matter. Was he rejecting at that point? Not a true story of God. He's rejecting a false caricature of God. And so consequently, the rejection of his faith comes from some of these assaults that were in essence inaccurate, but when he was a child, he didn't know this. He was born with the deformity of his thumbs. Consequently, he was very awkward when he would play games. Going to public schools, games were important. And when Lewis was awkward, he was made fun of. Matter of fact, he said, my friends, I could never use scissors, but my friends would build castles. I had to content myself with writing about them. Little did he know that this awkwardness and deformity of thumbs would contribute to his going to pen and paper very young. We're all beneficiaries of his writing ability, but it starts young. But nevertheless, at that time, he didn't have any perspective for this. He just saw that he was made fun of. He had these deformities of this deformity of his thumb, and he got mad at God. He became a pessimist, he said. Matter of fact, he said, I became an atheist. I was a pessimist. I didn't believe in God, and I was mad at God for creating a world. And he said he didn't even see the incongruities in his views at that particular moment. And he also saw bad witnesses for Christ, and he didn't want anything to do with Christianity. And therefore, he was turning his back on the one thing that could bring together head and heart. He writes in Surprised by Joy, chronicling his slow recovery of faith and his discovery of how Christ in the end was able to fit the stone in the shell. But he has his lapse and his recovery. That's one thread. Another thread going through the book, it has to do with the shell, or the romantic longing. Lewis develops how he was haunted by longings and the quest to find the object of his deepest longing from his earliest days. There are various terms he uses for this longing throughout the book, and also in many of his other books as well. One word is the German word Sehnsucht, which means longing, basically, but longing of an intense and deep kind. So sometimes it could be a kind of homesickness, an ache for home. Sweet desire is another phrase he uses in Pilgrims Regress. He references the blue flower, both in Surprised by Joy and in Pilgrims Regress. What was the blue flower? In the Romantic literature that was so popular in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the blue flower was a symbol in this literature. I've got a thick book called Blue Flower Stories that were all written during that time. The blue flower was a flower that would be seen off in the distance, almost like we see a mirage on a hot day on an asphalt road, like there's water up ahead. And when we get there, it's not there. The blue flower was always something people were pursuing, but once they got to the place where it was, it disappeared. And Lewis talks about this longing like the blue flower. His most common word, though, for this longing is the word joy. Joy. Joy is always a shorthand for this deep, deep longing and the quest to find its object. The three things that awaken longing are often thought to be the object of desire, these very things that awaken desire. So Lewis calls them false infinites in Paralandra. In James 1:17, we read, every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. The perfect gift comes down, but the perfect gift is a gift that was given to woo us to God, but never given to replace God. And so God, who has no variation or shifting shadow, God who's immutable, is constant. But the gifts themselves, they eventually fade. They're the things that moth and rust break in and thieves, moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. Francis Thompson, in his poem, The Hound of Heaven, Lewis references this poem in the book. He says, Francis Thompson, that the things that awaken desire have a traitorous trueness to them. A traitorous trueness. What does that mean? Well, they're traitorous to us. The God who gives them knows that they can't ultimately fulfill. So we think they're going to fulfill. They prove traitorous to us. But they remain true to the giver because they were never given as replacements. And so they keep us questing. Matter of fact, Lewis has a phrase that he uses in Surprised by Joy called the dialectic of desire. That's when I take my heart that is awakened by some experience and sets my heart a questing for something, someone, something that can bring order out of the chaos of my life. And I tether my heart to that object. When that object lets me down, I untether. I tether to something else. It lets me down, I untether, tether to something else. And I go through what Lewis calls this oscillating dialectic of desire. As a matter of fact, in an essay he wrote in Present Concerns called Talking About Bicycles, Lewis says that we have 4 phases of enchantment. 1, to be unenchanted. Nothing is triggered in us this longing. 2 is to be enchanted. We experience something in our life and it sets our heart to longing. Then we find that the thing that set our heart to longing can't fulfill us. So the 4th phase, or 3rd phase, is to be disenchanted. Then we stay disenchanted till we find something else that re-enchants us. So he talks about re-enchantment. Ultimately, the highest form of re-enchantment is to find that this longing ultimately leads us to God. But most of us, again, isolate between the enchanted, disenchanted, enchanted, disenchanted, enchanted, disenchanted, till we find that God can satisfy our deepest longing. Lewis writes an essay, it's in God in the Dark, called First and Second Things. If I put first things first, God first, I can enjoy all these second things for what they were meant to be, things to enjoy, gifts from the Father, and so on. But if I put second things first, I lose out on both second things and first things. So here then is Lewis's instruction in this regard. The third thread. So the first thread is his Christian faith that atrophied, the childhood faith that was inaccurate. The second thread is the longing, the romantic longing, issues of the heart. And then we finally find the third thread, which is reason. He thinks his reason is going to take him where he needs to go. But what he doesn't realize is that reason needs to also have substance to it. And Lewis tethered his reason to concepts and ideas and philosophies that could keep him in his sin, so to speak, but never quite satisfied him intellectually because it wasn't tethered in its sense to the transcendent. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis writes this, speaking again of 2 of these threads. The 2 hemispheres of my mind were in sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many island sea of poetry and myth. This was the romantic, the shell, so to speak. On the other side, a glib, shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. Here again is trying to fit the stone in the shell. What I think is the what I think is the cause of the fracture, as I mentioned before, is sin. And Lewis, Surprised by Joy, is a book about reconciliation, putting together the stone and the shell by means of a Christian faith. And so we'll pick it up here as we go through some of the more details of the book. In the early part of this book, Lewis says the absence of beauty characterized his childhood. He said, I never saw a beautiful building growing up. I never knew a building could be beautiful. I remember once giving lectures over in Belfast. The people who set up the lectures knew the woman who owned his boyhood home, Little Lee, and I was invited to come and explore that house. I was able to have 2.5 hours to look all over the house. I went into the little end room where he was. I looked out his bedroom window. I could see how he could have watched from his bedroom window the Belfast locks while they were building the Titanic. It's fascinating. As I was going through that house, when I walked in, the first thing I thought was this passage in Surprised by Joy. I never saw a beautiful building, and I never knew a building could be beautiful. That house was stunningly beautiful. When you walked inside the house, there was a massive entryway. It was all dark wood. At one end, there was a walk-in fireplace that had cobalt blue tile and bronze fire grates. His father had it built in Norway and shipped to Ireland. It was dark as you entered, but then there was all this lift because there was a winding staircase that went up to the second floor, and the ceiling on the entry was open up to the second floor, and there were all kinds of windows, and it was light and airy, almost like a perpendicular cathedral, where you come in and you see the dark stones and the stained glass window, and then all of a sudden you lift your heads up and you see the airier lights with the windows that are open to the outside, and all the architecture itself gives you the sense of lift and worship. This entry was sort of like that. What did he mean he had never seen a beautiful building? Well, we get a hint of it when he said the first beauty I ever noticed was when my older brother Warren brought into the nursery a toy garden on a cookie tin, a biscuit tin. He said with pieces of moth and leaves and twigs and stuff like that. He said, what all real gardens failed to do to me, that garden did. In other words, Lewis was surrounded by beauty. The whole world was crying out to him as it cries out to us. But interestingly enough, we are so unattentive. But oftentimes there will be something that awakens in us a beckoning call. Maybe it be to beauty at first. Maybe it be to longing secondly. But ultimately, it's God wooing us through these events and these experiences. Now Lewis talks about this toy garden, but then he talks about seeing hills out his childhood window. There's the Hollywood Hills that are pretty close to his home. And then there were the Castlereagh Hills that were across the Belfast Lough. And these hills are nothing as far as the drive. The Hollywood Hills, you could walk to them, but when his little legs would try to motor, they might as well have been on the dark side of the moon. But he would look out his window and long to go there. And that fed this longing also, these kinds of experiences. But the experiences, interestingly enough, were experiences in things that he saw, in nature, in art, architecture, and so on. But he begins to have then an opportunity to let the things that he reads speak to the longing and give it some content. We can look at nature and we can learn a lot from nature. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. The Hebrew word there is El. The heavens declare the glory of God. The earth showeth his handiwork. And then it goes on to say, but the word of the Lord, and when it starts using the word of the Lord, it uses the Hebrew name Yahweh, God's covenant-making personal name. So we can learn a lot about God in nature, but it's a generic name. You want to learn him personally, you need to learn through the word, the scriptures, but also so too the content of word where Lewis is now able to piece together by virtue of thought. He said he read Squirrel Nutkin by Beatrice Potter. And the thing that came through to him was the idea of autumn. It's a quality. He said he started reading Norse mythology. And he said these things that came to him through Norse mythology were things never to be described except to say that they were cold, spacious, severe, pale, remote. These are adjectives. They're qualities. They're the things that we can taste, smell, get the aroma of, but maybe can't quite get the thing itself. It's interesting that when Lewis writes that hideous drink, there's a bear staying with Ransom and the group of good people at the manor, St. Anne's, and this bear's name is Mr. Bultitude. One of the finest things I think Lewis wrote is his description of Mr. Bultitude's mind. And he says that his whole world was a world of nounless adjectives or adjectives floating in a nounless void. They were qualities. And when he's trying to find out about God, he's discovering the quality of God without the specificity. Who could ever get their minds around the specifics of the infinite when our minds are so finite? So anyway, this is where the longing starts to waken up. Lewis starts to follow it, and he starts to follow it through the written word. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But as far as his reasoning is concerned, his mother's death, he says of his mother's death, the continent of Atlantis had sunk. His life was all seas and islands after that. This image looms large in much of Lewis's writing. He talks about, again, the awakening of longing and the things that can't satisfy it, but he says later in Surprised by Joy that his world had become a many island sea of poetry and myth versus a glib, shallow rationalism. It's interesting that in Perelandra also, in Perelandra, it's the story of Ransom going to Venus, and it's a new planet. And there's this new couple, this Adam and Eve couple on the planet. It's a planet of a great sea with a continent, but it's mostly floating islands. Instead of picking a fruit from a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the fall would occur, in this planet, the fall occurs if you try to overnight on the continent. And what Lewis is, again, here's seas and islands. What Lewis is saying is if you have what you think is permanent and you camp there, you will be deluding yourself because those things are not permanent. Ultimately, only God is permanent. And so consequently, he's saying that we have to learn to stay in the realm of the quality. But when reason settles on something, you see it today, you see people in some of the debates that are going on in the political arena. I'm for science. I go, really? What science are you from? Science is always a changing discipline because new data is always coming in. It always has to reevaluate itself. You read Thomas Kuhn, the scientist, a philosopher of science, his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He says the paradigms of science are constantly changing. If a person says to you, I buy into science, I don't buy into anything else. Well, they're delusional because they don't realize that science is always changing, if they're going to be honest about it. So you overnight on this present understanding of science, it's like overnighting on the continent, and there's a fall. There's a fall that takes place because you've deluded yourself. You've come up with some rational explanation. Lewis says, I want God, not my idea of God. I want my neighbor, not my idea of my neighbor. I want myself, not my idea of myself. I would say I want science, not my present idea of science. So his quest needed to be worked out in the midst of conflict. The conflict between his reason that had drifted away from his childhood faith and the conflict that was going on in his heart as he longed for some object that was never fully given. He had the conflict in his school life. He then was sent to prepare for his entry into Oxford University. He writes about this to William T. Kirkpatrick. He calls him the Great Knock. And Kirkpatrick was a guy who was studying for theology when he was younger at Queen's University in Belfast. And something happened. He went from theological training to atheism. But Lewis said of any person he ever met, he was the most rational man. If you want to find Lewis's kindly depiction of him, he's Professor Dirk Diggory Kirk in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But with Kirkpatrick, he developed a rigorous, rational, logical life. And as long as he could make rationalizations for atheism, he didn't think he needed to look to God. And as time passed, he began to just discount God. He became a materialist. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But he also cultivated friendships at this time. One was with Arthur Greaves, who lived across the street from him. He said he was his first friend. A first friend is a person, Lewis says, who reads all the same books you do and gets the same things out of them. That's good because it tells you you're not alone in this world. You're not so weird as you might think you are. And he and Greaves had common interests. And out of those common interests, read these books. He said, we not only like the same books, we like the same parts in the same books. But he had a second friend, and his second friend was Owen Barfield. We met at Oxford University. He dedicated his book, The Allegory of Love, to Barfield. But Barfield said this about his friendship with Lewis. The experience of oneself over against that which is not oneself is a sine qua non of human consciousness. Sine qua non, that without which there is nothing. Let me read it to you again. Barfield writing about his friendship with Lewis. The experience of oneself over against that which is not oneself is a sine qua non of human consciousness. It breaks me out of the possibility of projecting on other things rather than having things conflict with my present understanding, so I have to think critically about them. Lewis says the second friend is a person who also has common interests, and they read all the same books you read, but they get something completely different out of them. So consequently, they invite you into a dialectical engagement, which allows for the possibility of growth, robust growth, and so on. But also Lewis added other friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, Neville Coghill. All these particular people that he met at Oxford, they were all Christians. And he said Coghill was the smartest guy in their class at Oxford. And Lewis was shocked. It brought him to a moment of disequilibrium. His present conceptual framework, that Christians were all stupid or deficient or behind. When he started meeting Coghill and seeing how bright he was and seeing that he was a Christian, Lewis said, maybe I need to reevaluate some things. He also found at this time in his life that the books that he was reading, the ones that he was most thrilled about, were books that were written by Christians. I'm going to read you something that he wrote in Surprised by Joy in just a moment. But one of the books he read was Fantastes by George MacDonald. And Lewis said he went to Leatherhead Station. By the way, I try to go to all these places. Like I mentioned, Little Lee. I went to Leatherhead Station. I had to see it. It's a very nondescript place. It's hard to believe something so significant in Lewis's life took place there. Even World War I. I went over and I went through all the places where Lewis fought during World War I. I wanted to see him for myself. There was one person who had one of their books on Lewis has a biographical section. Lewis was injured at a place called Mont Bernicon. And this person said, Lewis was injured taking a mountain. Mount Bernicon is as mountainous as Mount Prospect, Illinois, which is about as mountainous as a pancake. Anyway, you go see these things and they help bring some light to some of the descriptions that Lewis gives. But this Fantastes, I had to go read it. Read chapter 13 of Fantastes sometimes, just that one chapter. He writes to his friend Arthur Greaves, whatever you're doing right now, set it aside, go by Fantastes, and particularly read the story of Cosmo. Chapter 13. Lewis said when he read the story, his imagination was baptized. And in some senses, it gave him a flavor. There again is the flavor, the quality of redemption. It would take Lewis longer before he came to faith, but these things are all nudging him in the right direction. So here's what Lewis says in Surprised by Joy about his reading. All the books were beginning to turn against me. Indeed, I must have been blind as a bat not to have seen long before the ludicrous contradiction between my theory of life and my actual experiences as a reader. George MacDonald had done more for me than any other writer. Of course, it was a pity he had that bee in his bonnet about Christianity. He was good in spite of it. G.K. Chesterton had more sense than all the other moderns put together, baiting, of course, his Christianity. Johnson, and here he means Samuel Johnson, was one of the few authors whom I felt I could trust utterly. Curiously enough, he had the same kink. Spencer and Milton, by a strange coincidence, had it too. Even among the ancient authors, the same paradox was to be found. The most religious, Plato, Aeschylus, Virgil, were clearly those on whom I could really feed. On the other hand, those writers who did not suffer from religion and with whom, in theory, my sympathy ought to have been complete, Shaw, Wells, Mill, Gibbon, and Voltaire, all seemed a little thin. What as boys we called tinny. I know my dad used to call it a bad toy, a cheap toy. He would call it tinny. It wasn't that I didn't like these authors. They were all, especially Gibbon, entertaining, but hardly more. There seemed to be no depth in them. They were too simple. The roughness and density of life did not appear in their books. Now that I was reading more English, the paradox began to be aggravated. I was deeply moved by the dream of the rood. Rood is a medieval word for cross, the dream of the cross. More deeply still by Langland, intoxicated for a time by John Donne, deeply and lastingly satisfied by Thomas Browne. These are Christians. But the most alarming of all was George Herbert. Here was a man who seemed to me to excel all the authors I had ever read in conveying the very quality of life as we actually live it, from moment to moment. But the wretched fellow, instead of doing it all directly, insisted on mediating it through what I still would have called the Christian mythology. Now he mentioned some of the non-Christian authors. I thought Bacon, to speak frankly, a solemn, pretentious ass. I yawned my way through Restoration comedy. And having manfully struggled on to the last line of Don Juan, that's by Lord Byron, wrote on the end leaf, never again. By the way, you want to see that book, come to the Wade Center. We've got Lewis's library here. You can pull it off the stacks and look at the last page. He writes the date when he read it and never again. The only non-Christians who seemed to me really to know anything were the Romantics, and a good many of them were dangerously tinged with something like religion, even at times with Christianity. The upshot of it all could have nearly been expressed in a perversion of Roland's great line, the chanson, Christians are wrong, but all the rest are bores. The natural step would have been to inquire a little more closely whether the Christians were, after all, wrong. But I did not take it at that time. He saw these authors, it intrigued him, but he didn't take the step. Instead, he drifted towards materialism. He had come across this idea that he got from Bergson, claims to have gotten it from Bergson, the idea of necessary existence. This is a basic ontological concept. Ontology is a study of being and existence. If you live in a world of contingencies, things that exist but only exist because something prior to them exists, and you stretch that string back, you can't go back ad infinitum. Because if there was nothing that had permanent existence, none of the contingencies would ever start. And so Lewis got this idea of necessary existence. But in ontological studies, if we painted with broad brushstrokes, there'd be two basic areas. One would be something supernatural is necessary, or that matter is necessary. Well, Lewis chose to go with matter. He would believe that matter itself is eternal, and matter just reconfigures, but it's always existed. His friendship with Owen Barfield, remember that friend, the second friend that challenges what you think? Owen Barfield and he entered into what Lewis calls the Great War. And in the Great War, Lewis challenged him on a couple of different things. First, he challenged him on what he called chronological snobbery. Lewis had this idea that whatever was newest was best. And it's a little bit like Isaac Newton, he was the one who said, if I've seen farther than others, it's while sitting on the shoulders of giants. Today, it's as if people were saying, it's amazing we can see as far as we can, given the pygmies that preceded us. That's chronological snobbery. And from our perspective of the moment, we begin to periodize, cut things up. And we look back and we talk about the Middle Ages as a period that exists at this time. Lewis says there's nothing in the history of thought like a shoreline in geography. This minute I'm in the water, this minute I'm on the shore. Nobody's running around in the Middle Ages saying, I live in the Middle Ages. That's a convention that we project back. Usually, if you find in the history of thought, there's some things that get pruned along the way and some things that are perennial and remain. And Lewis was told by Barfield, that's the way you should be thinking, and Lewis got it. But also in this Great War, Barfield said materialism leaves no room for any satisfactory theory of knowledge. A materialist looks at the lovers. The man looks at the woman. Her image is projected on the retina of his eye through a series of electrical synapses. It travels along back to the brain, stimulates the brain, causes secretion of particular hormones. He says it's love. The materialist says, no, it's not love. It's just chemistry. It's just chemistry. And he wants you to believe his explanation. But as Barfield convinced Lewis, the materialist also is in the same predicament because he looks at the lovers. They project an image on the retina of his eye through a series of electrical synapses, travels along his optic nerves, causes a stimulation and the secretion of particular hormones. He says it's an explanation. Why does he want you to believe his explanation is valid when the lovers can't say their love is valid? And Lewis says that they reason away, and that materialism left no room for satisfactory theory of knowledge. And Lewis comes to a place where he says explicitly in the book Miracles, I cannot believe reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. This is fascinating. Well, consequently, in light of this, Lewis says he's comparing his movements through these conundrums of trying to bring together the stone and the shell, and he comes to this place where he experiences checkmate. And he says there were basically 5 moves. He read Euripides by Hippolytus. And in this story, it's a story of betrayal and remarkable forgiveness. It's a very moving play. I hope you could go read it. By the way, all those authors that Lewis said he read, and the Christian ones attracted him, and non-Christian, I've gone back to try and read those authors. I want to see what he experienced. He read Alexander's Space, Time, and Deity. And in Space, Time, and Deity, Alexander says there's 2 ways we can approach a thing. We can contemplate it, we can look at it, or we can move into it and actually experience it. Lewis would later write an essay about this called Meditations in the Tool Shed. So he walked into the tool shed, saw a beam of light coming through a cranny in the roof, a beam of sunshine, and he looked at it and he saw the dust particles in it. That was one experience. He stepped in it and he felt the radiant heat. He looked up and saw the blinding brightness. And he said, these are 2 different experiences. And he realized that thinking about longing and longing itself, that reason and longing, that reason and the heart could somehow exist and coexist together. That book helped him. It started to link his thoughts on joy and longing with idealism, but he later found out that idealism didn't work for him, the pantheism. He read Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. That was the 4th move towards his being in checkmate. And the whole Christian outline of history set out in a form that seemed to make sense. And Lewis got it. And then he passed from his idealism and his pantheism to theism. But he says at that point in his life, he didn't think he could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare. He finally has a late night talk with his friend J.R.R. Tolkien and his friend Hugo Dyson. And Tolkien said, you love myths, you love the stories, you love the imaginative, you love the idea of the dying God who comes down into history and dies in order to give of himself for his creation. How come you don't like the story when you encounter it in the one place where it reports to be history, where it actually happened? Lewis was so deeply moved by that 2 weeks later, on September 28th, 1931, he's in the sidecar of his brother Warren's motorcycle on his way to the Whipsnade Zoo. I had to go see the Whipsnade Zoo, right? You got to go see these things. He said, when I set out on the ride, I didn't believe. By the time I got to the zoo, I was a Christian. Because Lewis realized the illustration about Hamlet and Shakespeare was in fact a good one. If Hamlet could ever get to know the author, it couldn't depend upon Hamlet breaking out of the play. God had to make it possible for him so that Shakespeare could have written himself into the play as a character and made the introduction between Hamlet and Shakespeare possible. He said, I think that's in fact what happened. So while the joy prodded him, even through all these rational conundrums, the rejection of a false Christianity of his childhood, and eventually a rejection of his more sophisticated but wrong materialism of his adulthood. He finally came to the place where this joy kept driving him. And he hung in there until he finally came up with a rational understanding of the faith that made it possible to fit the stone in the shell. Lewis said he still has experiences of joy, but they don't thrill him as much. He says, like if you're lost in the woods, the sign of a signpost is a big matter. But once you're well on the way, though their lettering be of silver and the posts be of gold, he said, we won't camp there for long. We would be in Jerusalem. And he continues on. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Once he gets to his conversion, he stops. Why? Because the reason why he wrote the book was testimonial apologetics. He wanted to tell how he moved from atheism to Christianity. So I think we'll probably close it off there. There's a lot more details in the book we could go into, that background we could give, but I think that's probably enough for now. I hope that was helpful. If you haven't read the book, I hope you read it. And I hope your experience will be similar to mine, that he may give you a vocabulary for your own soul as you read this book.
Okay.
There's somebody named Jeanette Christie. She wants to know the name of the book again. It's called Surprised by Joy. This is one of my several copies, and you can see how it's just falling apart with all the markings and all that stuff. But Surprised by Joy, the shape of my early life. And Lewis's autobiography. It came out in 1955 or 56, I think. And the American edition is Harcourt Brace in 1956.
Jerry, in Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis spends some time talking about how his relationship with his father impacted him. And that seems to be something that continued to affect him on, into his late 20s when his father actually died. Would you describe how that relationship developed and how it affected Lewis's, his own thinking?
Well, Lewis's father was a brilliant man. He was a police court solicitor in Belfast. He was also a unionist. He wanted to keep Ireland united with England. Lewis was a home rule guy. He and his father had some conflict there over political issues. But also Lewis's father, when his mother died, Lewis's father sent C.S. Lewis and his brother Warren to a school in Watford, England. Lewis writes about it in his autobiography and calls it Belsen. Belsen was a concentration camp in Germany during World War II. Lewis says it was a horrible experience. So his mother dies. He's 2.5 weeks past his death of his mother, and he's sent basically into the hands of a madman. Robert Capron, who was a headmaster at that school, he would be declared insane. Lewis was there for 2 years. 6 months after Lewis's father finally gets the boys out of there, they complained all the time. 6 months later, he's declared insane and dies in a mental institution. So Lewis is sent from the death of his mother into the hands of a madman. So right there was some conflict. The father didn't really try to understand his boys so much. I think the father loved his boys, but I think he had some limits, and he had lost his mother too. I mean, his wife, and she probably provided some of the emotional stability in that family. But Lewis said his father was a great speaker and orator. I think Lewis probably picked up some of that from his father. But nevertheless, they had conflict, and they didn't get along very well. And Lewis, when he gets ready to go off to World War I, he needed to go to World War I. He wanted to go to Oxford, and he couldn't pass the math exam. But he found out if you went to World War I and were a soldier, you were exempt from the math exam, and that was his ticket to get into Oxford if he lived. But he's going to go to the war, and he's thinking some serious things about, I probably haven't been that good of a son. And he writes his dad, please come see me. And his dad doesn't come. He writes to his dad again. He says, I'm going to have to go off to the trenches pretty quick. Please come see me. I know I haven't always been a good son, but I can't get leave long enough to come see you. His dad writes back, I don't understand what you're talking about. He doesn't come. Third time he writes him, the dad doesn't come. He goes off to World War I, 3 times pleading with his father to see him. He's injured in the trenches. When he's injured, his brother finds out about it and gets a bicycle and rides 50 miles to see his brother in the field hospital. Lewis is sent back to England, to where the Slade School of Art is now, University College, University of London. And he's hospitalized there. And Lewis in the hospital writes to his father, come see me. I want to see you. His father still doesn't come even to see his injured father, his son. And Lewis realizes he hasn't been a great son, but he also then is pretty cool to his father. And basically his Irish home isn't his home anymore. And it ends up that he starts living with this Mrs. Moore, who was the mother of his friend who was killed. I don't think there was any skullduggery going on. I think I could give you some pretty good proof from it. Every once in a while, somebody tries to make it seem like there was some carrying on going on between those two. I don't believe a word of it. But Lewis was providing for her, and Lewis's father kept sending Lewis the money for him to live. And I think Lewis suspected that he was paying for more than just Lewis's livelihood. So there was more animosity there, but Lewis was a little bit deceptive with his father. This is a saw that cuts both ways. When Lewis's dad dies, Lewis feels deep and great remorse about the way he was towards his father. I think that also triggered some of his coming to faith. He writes about it a little bit in Surprised by Joy, where he realizes his own shortcoming, which brings him to the place where he writes in an essay called Christian Apologetics, the gospel has to be bad news before it's good news. It's almost something that Frederick Buechner writes in Telling the Truth, the Gospel is Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. And Lewis says you have to awaken in a person a sense of sin if you want them to hear the gospel. Begin with your own shortcomings, and that's a good way to do it. Don't point the other person's out, but be honest and transparent enough to talk about your own shortcomings. I think Lewis had that place that prepared him to make the final steps to faith because he was aware of his own shortcomings with his father. As soon as his father dies, they sell Little Lee. He and his brother take the money. They go to their church, St. Mark's in Dundilla, near Strandtown in Ireland, and they put in a massive window, stained glass window in the church, dedicated to their parents. This is right at the time of Lewis's conversion, or at least his conversion to theism. And I think that you see maybe some guilt, maybe some desire to honor his father. So that's how I would portray it.
Okay. We've had a couple of people ask about which books you would recommend for people who want to know about C.S. Lewis's life. So any biographies that that you would recommend?
Well, I still think that probably the best biography written on Lewis is the one by Walter Hooper and Roger Lansell Green. The thing is, it's very detailed. It doesn't go down real smooth, but it reads kind of like a laundry list, but it's accurate. I think that's good. I think that the smoothest reading one is the one by A.N. Wilson, but there's an inaccuracy on every page. It's very bad. It's well written, but it's not accurate. Again, the one by Lyle Dorset on Lewis's spiritual development. There's that one by Alan Jacobs. They're not pretentious. It's just on his imaginative development. I think McGrath's biography is good. It's certainly well written, but you have to be careful at the places where he starts to project. Lewis doesn't write about this, therefore we must assume that this was going on in him. That's the Lewis of McGrath's imagination. Probably, if you really want to get to know him as a man, read the 3 volumes of his letters. The letters that were put together. There's actually eight books of letters of Lewis's that are out there. But the 3-volume work that was edited by Walter Hooper will probably give you more of a biographical picture than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then along the lines of books, someone also asked, they said you'd mentioned several of the books that influenced Lewis. And so would you recommend maybe 3 or 4 of those that for somebody who's interested?
Well, I'll recommend authors. How's that?
Okay.
I think you would do well to read Plato. Lewis enjoyed Plato. He wasn't a Platonist. I can prove that too. I had a grad student one time go through all of Lewis's writings and find every reference to Plato and every reference to Aristotle. And Lewis would use Plato where Plato served his purpose, and he would disagree with him where he disagreed. Same thing with Aristotle, but he was a great lover of Plato. Dante would be another one. I would read the Vita Nuova, and then I'd read the Divine Comedy, and then I would read Charles Williams' book, The Figure of Beatrice, as a guide to take you through those books. Chaucer is another one. Not just Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, but Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, an important book for Lewis, and he spends quite a bit of time with it in the Allegory of Love. The Fairy Queen. Most people maybe don't want to read these books, but if you hang in there and read them, I guarantee you there's a great reward. I was a physical education major in college. My academic interest was staying eligible. I'm probably the only PE major in the world who's actually read The Fairy Queen and enjoyed it deeply, and sometimes dip back into it. Yeah. Augustine is another author who influenced him, and Milton's Paradise Lost would be another important one.
You also mentioned George Herbert.
George Herbert would be very important. He thought was his favorite lyric poet, and Dante was his favorite narrative poet.
And also Chesterton.
G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald too would be important.
Okay. Comment on his, toward the end of Surprised by Joy, he mentions this word keeps coming up of interferer. He calls God the
divine interferer.
Talk about that for a minute.
Well, Lewis's biggest idea in all of his books is reality is iconoclastic. We've talked about it before on these book things. I have an image of God. A couple pieces of the puzzle come together for me. If I hold on too tightly to that present image, it will compete against my having a growing understanding of God. And then Surprised by Joy, Lewis says God kicks out the walls of temples we build for him because he wants to give us more of himself. God's big. He's bigger than our biggest thoughts about him. So he's a divine interferer. He's a divine interferer in that whatever we're pursuing in God's place, God is destined to show us that that's the kind of thing moth and rust destroy, thieves break in and steal. So those false infinites, he calls them in Paralandra, those false infinites, he's a divine interferer. He shows us that they're not going to satisfy us. He's also the divine interferer, even if you're a believer and you have this understanding of God. It may be true at its core, but at the fringes, it's not complete. And consequently, then he's always wanting to give us more. And that sometimes is an interruption. It may be a bit of an inconvenience, but God wants our faith in him to be dynamic, not static, to be living, not inert and dead. So that way, he's a divine interferer.
One of my favorite quotes is from page 172. He says, no word in my vocabulary expressed deeper hatred than the word interference. But Christianity placed at the center what then seemed to me a transcendental interferer. If its picture were true, then no sort of, quote, treaty with reality could ever be possible. There was no region, even in the innermost depths of one's soul, nay, there least of all, which one could surround with barbed wire fence and guard with a notice, no admittance. And that was what I wanted, some area, however small, of which I could say to all other beings, this is my business and mine only.
It's brilliant. And the thing that's interesting to me about this, just like the toy garden, I don't know if that toy garden would have awakened in me a sense of longing or a sense of beauty. I think I was more attracted to Lewis's house. But beauty is all around us. It surrounds us. What is it that wakens you? And it will be unique. God, the divine interferer, the transcendent interferer. He goes after our hearts particularly because he's particularly interested in each of us individually. So consequently, you look at the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus, and he said, "What must I do to be saved?" And Jesus said, "Well, you know the law. What does it read to you?" And he tells him, and he says, "I've kept all these things since my youth." And Jesus says to the rich young ruler, "Go sell everything you have and give it to the poor." And the guy went away sorrowful because he had many things. But when Zacchaeus comes to Jesus, Zacchaeus says, "I'll give half of what I own to the poor." Jesus says, "That's okay." And then when Matthew comes, you don't have any record of Jesus saying, "Matthew, take all that money you've got from your tax collecting and give it to the poor." He goes after each individual at the place of resistance. And each of us has our own place. It's interesting.
Yeah, this is an interesting, in the book, it's an interesting point because Lewis has come to believe, he's a theist, but he's still not a Christian. And it seems like he's weighing the cost of what it means to actually, submit himself wholly to Christ. And so it's a good point in the book because I think it addresses something that oftentimes is left out of people's presentation of the gospel or whatever, is if Christ comes into your life, he's going to interfere with your most dearly held idols.
Well, it says in Scripture that we're made in the image of God, and after the fall, it says that he wants to restore the image in us. Well, I don't know about you, but if he's going to restore his image in me, he's got a lot of work to do. And the divine physician will often take his scalpel to those things growing in me that are distracting, that can be painful. Every son whom he loves, he reproves and disciplines. It says in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 that the scripture is profitable, not just to teach us, but to reprove us and to correct us and to train us in righteousness. That process is not always too pleasant, but I think in time, one day, we will see that the rewards are deep and rich and good, and the blinders will be removed utterly, and we'll see with greater clarity.
It seems like, in my opinion, one of his best depictions of this process is with Clarence Eustace Scrub,
Yeah,
the dragoning of Eustace.
yeah, it's a wonderful story.
Yeah, talk about that for just a minute.
Well, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader begins with this wonderful line. There once was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrub, and he almost deserved it. And that's written by Clive Staples Lewis, who knew nobody deserved to be named Clive Staples Lewis. That's why he went by the name Jack since the time he was young. Nevertheless, Eustace in this book is he has the heart of a dragon under the skin of a little boy. And he ends up in Narnia with his cousins, Edmund and Lucy. And in the magic of that world, he's actually turned into outside what he's always been inside. He's turned into a dragon. And there comes a point where he has an encounter with Aslan. Once he looks in a pond and sees what he's really like, he's so brokenhearted. It's a moment of great disequilibrium for him. And he knows he hasn't been good. It all comes up to him. It's like the rubber band you stretch so far, and if you let go of it, it snaps you. And he's been snapped by this reality. And Aslan the lion shows up and says to him, "You must undress yourself," as Eustace describes it later after he's been a dragon. He says, "I was bigger than the lion, but I was sure afraid." And then he realized dragons were like snakes and lizards, scaly things that could shed their skin. Maybe he could just shed his own skin. And with tremendous effort, he sheds the skin. Looks in the pond, still he's a dragon. The second time, tremendous effort, he sheds his skin. He's still dragon. Third time, frustrated, he looks at the lion, and the lion says, "I must undress you." Taking that lion claw, he goes all the way through that dragon flesh to that very dragon heart, Lewis writes, and makes him boy again. And interestingly enough, when he goes back to the Dawn Treader to tell the people at the Dawn Treader what happened to him, it's early in the morning and there's only one member of the Dawn Treader who's awake to receive him, as sort of a father confessing. And it's Edmund, the one who himself had to be sort of undragoned in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because he had done terrible things and betrayed his siblings, and Aslan had to give up his life to save him. And it's very tender how, no matter how bad we make of things, Christ wants to remake us, and not only remake us, he wants to redeploy us for kingdom service and work. It's very tender, actually. Very moved by it.
Yeah, it's very good. Very, very moving story. And, in the movie, I was disappointed in how it was depicted in the movie. So,
well, they didn't even put that in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader initially. And they didn't put into the part where he says, where Lucy's told she can't go back to Narnia, and she's weeping. She says, "Oh, Aslan, it isn't Narnia, it's you. How can I go on if I can't see you again?" And he says, "Oh, dear heart, I live in your world too, only though there I go by another name. And you've been brought here for a time to know me here, that you might know me better there. And it's time for you to go back and get to know me better there." That was also cut out of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And Doug Gresham, when he saw what they did, said, "No, you've got to go back and put that in." Cost him $250,000 to reinsert those things that they had failed to put in. The problem with the movie, though, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, instead of it being about longing for Aslan and Aslan's country and so on, with Reepicheep longing to go to Aslan's country, Lucy longing for Aslan, Eustace longing to be made well once he becomes dragon, and so on. They made it about fighting the fears of your heart and fighting the fears represented by the green mist. That's nowhere in the book. Why did they do that? They had a great readership that was already their fan followers, and they betrayed us in that third film.
Well, how would you summarize, or maybe you say it like this: what conclusions does Lewis come to about joy? Since the book is titled "Surprised by Joy," what conclusions does he come to about this concept of joy?
Well, joy is not the thing that he wants, ultimately. Joy is the pointer to the thing he wants. And so I think the conclusion that Lewis makes is that joy is helpful if it triggers in us the quest, and joy itself can become an idol if we're not careful. How does he say at the end? I faintly quoted it, not perfectly, but he writes us. Joy was valuable only as a pointer to something other and outer. When we're lost in the woods, the sight of a signpost is a great matter. He who first sees it cries, "Look!" The whole party gathers around and stares. But when we have found the road and are passing signposts every few miles, we shall not stop and stare. They will encourage us, and we shall be grateful to the authority that set them up. But we shall not stop and stare, or not much, not on this road, though their pillows are of silver and their lettering are of gold. We would be at Jerusalem. So joy is wonderful. Sometimes it would raise its beautiful head in his life again, but it wasn't the longing that he sought. It was God himself. Mm-hmm. So you go to, I know in my own quiet time every day, I begin with a time of worship. And I pray from Psalm 73, whom have I in heaven but thee? Besides thee, I desire nothing on earth. My heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. And I always pray every day, Lord, I want a larger portion of you. I want to know you better. I want to have such a heart for you that I will minimize the distractions of being tempted to vector off from you. The last thing I pray every night before I go to bed, when my head is on my pillow, I say, Lord, I love you. I don't love you very well, but I'm grateful that you make it so easy for me to love you at all. I love you, Lord. Those are the last things I say every night before I go to bed. So in the morning, I'm asking for a larger portion. And at night, I'm asking for a deeper and richer love for him.
Um,
I think that's very Lewisian.
yeah, yeah. Well, I was thinking there as you were talking, as you were quoting scripture. This is one of the things we encourage in the C.S. Lewis Fellows Program. It's in some ways, when I was a younger Christian, we were encouraged, to memorize scripture. And it seems like now that I'm an older man, I don't hear that as much anymore. But we encourage that.
You don't do what as much anymore?
I don't hear people talking about the need to memorize scripture.
Uh-huh.
Say a word about scripture memory and how that's encouraged your own faith.
Well, I would say I'm not a big Bible memory guy. I read it over and over and over again. And consequently, I have a lot memorized. But I know it by virtue of familiarity from reading it. I mean, I've read my whole Bible through 50 times. I'm in my 36th read of the New Testament. Besides that, I've read the Greek Bible through twice. And I just read it over and over again. I haven't missed a quiet time in 22 years. And I just am committed to this book. I know no other book quite like it. And so consequently, for me, the memory stuff is good. To treasure it and have it in your heart is good. But I don't get it from sitting down and just trying to, memorize it like I might memorize a Shakespeare play or something like that.
Yeah, people memorize in different ways. We have some people, who listen audio. They listen, to reading through audio. Some people by writing it out, so they write passages out, and through writing it kind of they're more tactile, when they're and so but I was impressed by how you said in your prayer life that it gave you like a language to be able to speak to God, by that psalm that you
Yeah.
recite every day.
When there are books on praying the Psalms into
Uh-huh.
also even reflections on the Psalms, Lewis said they're sung prayers. That's interesting. There's a question from Jacob Matthews. Should we look at that?
Yeah, so Jacob asks, Lewis states in Surprised by Joy that joy is, quote, an unsatisfied desire which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. He then writes in his letters to Malcolm, quote, joy is the serious business of heaven. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I thanks, Jacob. Jacob's a dear friend too, so it's fun to see him send this question. I think this idea that joy is the unsatisfied desire, which means that it is prompting me towards God, towards drawing closer to God. But when he says it's the serious business of heaven, I don't know exactly what Lewis has in mind, but I have a hunch that he means it sort of like G.K. Chesterton meant, that all positive joy exists on condition. And Chesterton writes about this in Orthodoxy in the chapter on the ethics of Elfland. And he also writes about it in a book that of essays that was put together called All Things Considered, not to be confused with the NPR program by that name. This book came out before there was an NPR. But in that, he writes an essay called Fairy Tales. And basically, he's saying that God invites us into joy, and he puts up a fence. You've got the fence like the Ten Commandments. They tell us all the things we shouldn't do. We push our noses up against the fence and long for the things that are outside of our grasp, and we bemoan them, not realizing that the fence is to keep us from those things that would hurt us. But also, if we would just turn our back to the fence, we would see the playground God has designed within the perimeters of the fence so we could enjoy life to the fullest, the way he intended. And so in that regard, joy is the serious business of heaven. Joy is that which invites us not only into relationship with God as we hunger and quest for him, but joy is also that thing that allows us to enjoy the gifts of God in right proportion, right place, and right time, not intemperately.
Well, we have a few minutes left, and I did want to ask you to say a few words about the book for next month, which we're encouraging people to read. Preface to Paradise Lost. So say a few words about that book.
Well, it might be good not only for them to read the preface to Paradise Lost, but also Paradise Lost itself. The although because Lewis's book is a preface to Paradise Lost, you could start there, no problem. Lewis talks in this book about the literary form. Earlier, I quoted when Lewis says, when a man writes a love song, he not only loves a beloved, he also loves a sonnet. That's from a preface to Paradise Lost. So Lewis is talking about the various literary forms of epic poetry, how Homer used a particular form, and how Virgil used a particular form, how Milton uses a particular form. But they capture the form that helps them tell the story. And Milton is telling this epic story about the creation, about the fall, and about God intervening on our behalf at that particular point. It's magisterial. But Lewis also talks about things related to the influence of Augustinian theology on Milton's thinking. He talks about, he has some things on longing in there as well, I think, that are wonderful. He has some interesting theological concepts about Satan. And also the capital in Milton's hell, the capital of hell is pandemonium. When you think of the word pandemonium, Bill, what do you think of? Confusion, right? But the word pandemonium literally means all demons. So the diabolical leads to confusion. But the way of God leads to grace and order, but not an order that's repressive.
Shalom.
An order that is structural, that gives us freedom. You know, I have a skeletal structure. It gives me the freedom for my body to be fleshed out on that and to move and enjoy life and so on.
Yeah, one way I picture that is, you know, with water, if you have water that's has boundaries, like a river, it can, you know, bring you can use it to water and, you know, fish and all that. But if water overflows the banks, if it has no direction or structure to it, it's destructive.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is commandments, you know, are like that. They can be blessing, you know, they can bless.
Well, Lewis, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Lewis's wife wrote a book called Smoke on the Mountain. And it's a retelling of the Ten Commandments from a positive perspective. So she begins it with a story. There was a missionary who was a legalist, and he goes to this African chieftain of a tribe, and he's talking to him about his Christianity. And the African chieftain said, "Let me see if I've got you right. If I become a Christian, I can't commit adultery. I can't kill my enemy. I can't steal my neighbor's food. I can't do any of that stuff." And the missionary says, "Yes, that's right." He said, "Oh, well, then being a Christian must be the same as being old, because I'm old now and I can't do any of those things anyway." and she talks about the fact that you need to have a positive restatement of the law. And I think that's right. Lewis actually wrote an introduction to that book too. So these were not concepts that were unfamiliar to him.
Yeah. Well, hey, thank you, Jerry. I enjoyed that. I've read Surprised by Joy a number of times, and it's always insightful and always great to hear how the other things that you bring in to enhance the reading of it. So thanks to you, and thanks to all of you who joined us this evening. And we look forward to next time to A Preface to Paradise Lost, and then to Miracles in December. So you can contact us through the website. My email address is there, and we have a number of ways, different extensions. If you're, I noticed some of the cities from all over. So if you want to contact someone, an extension that's near you, you can find out how to do that from the website. So thanks again, Jerry, and
Thank you.
look forward to being with you next time. Okay.
Thank you very much.